Welcome, my name is Elena, and here we talk books. So let's rewind and talk about what I read in June. We got off to a rough start in June by reading Malina by Ingeborg Bachmann, published in 1971 in German. The setting is post-Second World War, Vienna. Our narrator is a woman, but she is unnamed. She lives with a man by the name of Malina. She becomes infatuated with another man by the name of Ivan, who's a divorced father of two. The structure of this novel nearly broke my brain. I mean, my brain was buffering like the early 2000s AOL dial-up. It's incredibly fragmented. And there are these concepts of death styles where it gives the kind of that push towards a final act. And sometimes we get that. We get that closure by her either throwing herself off of a stage to kill herself or her father committing her murder. And again, because it's so fragmented, the pieces, it doesn't feel like there's anything here to put together. It's almost as if the only option for understanding this novel or going through it, getting through it, is just like being shell-shocked for shell-shock's sake, and then just come at the end, and then we have this erasure of the narrator. There is a potential, I think, for her to be schizophrenic. Ivan and Malina never meet. Although she becomes infatuated by Ivan, he comes over, she spends time with him. Malina does not know of Ivan's existence. I think it's also interesting that this narrator, her world evolves around three men: her father, Malina, and Ivan. And she's essentially learning to deconstruct under their sort of, I mean, they're like her puppeteers. But it almost feels like she craves that violence in a way. Definitely a trigger warning. There's a lot of sexual and domestic violence, abuse, incest with her father. And I think I read that her father, the author, Ingeborg Bachmann's father, was a member of the Nazi party. So in a way, it almost seems like that makes a lot of sense for the men to be who they are. Malina is sort of also this androgynous, almost sexless, passionless character. There's a lot happening, and someone said in the reviews that you need to read this 2-3 times to sort of latch onto any sort of concrete concepts or let it sort of sink in. I'm not there yet. I was quite relieved when I was done with this book and almost ready to put it down, a little annoyed that I did not understand it. Second book was Gray Bees by Andrey Kurkov, written in 2018, translated by Boris Draluk in 2020. This little gem of a book is about Sergei Sergeyevich from the little Ukrainian town of Little Stahorodivka. Essentially, this little town has now become known as a gray zone. It contains Russian separatists, Ukrainian forces, loyalists, Crimean Tatars, what have you. And he remains one of the 2 people left in that little village. And they are being bombed daily. There's shells flying. The shells finally take out the church. And he's a man in his latter 40s, I would say. his wife has left him and she's taken their daughter. And there's this sense of where does one fit in life, you know, as just a human being. Like if we were to take humanity out of someone and they just sort of went about robotically about their day, it's almost that is the skeleton of this person, right? He goes by the clock. He has an alarm clock, and he's sort of obsessed with keeping that time, although the other person in the village makes fun of him. Pasha, who, it's hilarious because they were arch nemesis in school, but they're the last two remaining in the village, and so they have to talk to someone. But Pasha makes fun of him for like, why are you keeping time? What does it matter what time it is? But it's sort of that Sergei is learning how to navigate surviving or living in this dead little town, also by being shelled and destroyed on the daily. But he has a redeeming quality, Sergei, and that is his love for his bees. And I really enjoy the way that Kurkov and Draluk, like the plain language of sort of assessing a man just at the roots. There's sort of no flowery, no sort of like incredible interdimensional work. It's sort of this man understands that his bees, they need salvation, and to grant them that, he is willing to leave his little town and travel across Ukraine, across the border, and of course he meets so many various different characters, you know, Ukrainian separatists, Russian separatists, loyalists, Crimean Tatars, and everyone that he comes into, you know, they have a response, an immediate reaction. Oh, you're in Donbass, you're in that gray zone. Oh, so that means that you're this bad person, or you're one of them. And it's just the very banal things about life of someone who kind of looks at it in a different gaze and says, listen, I just want to take care of my bees. I'm not fighting anybody. I just want to live. And there's definitely some heartbreak and heartache in this novel, but I recommend it to people who are sort of interested in seeing, you know, the 21st century take on Ukraine and its various conflicts. It was such... There were moments of pure joy, but also like hilarity in this book, and I really appreciated the various nuances that Kurkov was able to marry these concepts at intersection of humanity, life, survival, war, threat, and yet this sort of basic need to protect what's most precious to you. And yeah, it was, I think put another hold for another Kurkov book at the library, so I'm excited to read more from him. Next book was Giovanni's Room. Thank you, book club, because this has been on my TBR, of course, for a few years now, probably more. But my book club did read this in the month of June, and of course this is written by James Baldwin in 1956. Yes, everything about this book. I loved it. I loved the confabulation, the intersection between identity, crisis of identity, but also race, sex, gender, power, politics, corruption, The characters in this book, I think, each play a pivotal role. Like, nothing is wasted in Giovanni's room. Nothing. Every page, every conversation, every thought is just so well placed. It's incredible. It's incredible. So David is a white man living in Paris. He encounters Giovanni, who escapes Italy after a traumatic event in his life. And David has already experimented or had, homosexual tendencies and develops a relationship with Giovanni. But do not be mistaken. This book, I feel, is less about that interaction, like that love story, than more so about David's identity, like that, the propulsion of living a life and interacting with others when you are at these crossroads and you feel it and it's almost palpable enough, and yet you have to make choices. Even your lack of choice is a choice. And what does that mean? And what are the consequences for you and the people in your life? And I really, honestly, if this is on your TBR or it's not, and you just needed that extra boost to get to it a little quicker, let this be your boost. I think it's incredibly valid and even so timely in today's, this was just honestly a perfection of a book. So I'm so glad that I finally got around to it. Next was Artful by Ali Smith. So Artful is a play on the form. We think it's a novel about the main character loses her partner. And this is based off of the author Ali Smith's 2012 lectures that she gave to St. Anne's College in Oxford. And it talks about art and literature and the writing form. She begins to be literally haunted by her partner's ghost, and she's motivated to revisit their desk and their papers as they were working and writing. And as she's going through that, she's also rereading Oliver Twist. There's a lot of name dropping of Shakespeare, Catherine Mansfield, I think Rebecca West, Charles Dickens, of course, and how it is that through this traumatic event in her life, she seems to make various shapes and forms and little nuances of purpose that are found within her play of these ideas. I found it interesting. I found like the actual form of the novel itself, which could have so easily been autofiction or even autobiography, or it was very interesting. I would be interested to read more forms where there's that intersection of talking about art while demonstrating in not a pedantic manner, or didactic actually. So that was enjoyable. Next book was Women at Point Zero by Nawal el-Saadawi. So begins for us a story leading to her grimy Cairo prison cell where she welcomes her death sentence as a relief from her pain. Yeah. This book is about Firdaus, who's born into a peasant family. She suffers from childhood cruelty, neglect. There's no sort of salvation by education in this book, as sometimes there are with such stories. she's forced to marry a much older man who is incredibly violent towards her. There is quite a bit of violence in this book, and sexual prowess and domination of men. Like, honestly, reading this book, I felt so fed up with the men in general in this, because I think what Nawal does really well is capturing even those little moments where Firdas is in this new position, and she makes friends with someone, and she feels, wow, perhaps this is my new life, and this is a new safe place, and I can belong here because I don't belong anywhere. But men are gonna be men. And so she often has to start over and over again. She becomes a prostitute. She meets Sharifa, who then she also ends escaping from, because essentially Sharifa is using her is pimping her out. She's a pimp. And when she sort of comes to that realization, she runs, and there is a final act committed of murder, and so she's sentenced to death. It's, you know, this is a book that it's, I think, meaningful to read, but it's hard to understand or to grapple with the idea that nothing in this world can prepare you for death. And yet, as she's running from new identity to the next, to trying to find and make her way, she doesn't want to be a prostitute. She wants to actually work in an office, and she does, but it's almost worse than when she was on the streets prostituting her body. This is a perfect example of how women can't win. And so it's the last act, and you are a woman, and what are you going to do? Yeah. A very gripping read. Next book was A Girl Returned by Donatelli di Pietrantonio, translated, of course, by the indelible Anne Goldstein, who does Elena Ferrante's translations, or La Minuta, which is A Girl Returned in Italian. I didn't realize sometimes I haven't sat down and actually thought about all of these books at once, but man, was June a reading month, huh? A girl is returned to a family in Italy that's impoverished, and she's essentially returned by, I think her aunt and uncle once removed, something like that, because she doesn't know, but at the age of, when she's 13, this aunt, who she calls Mama, becomes pregnant, and they choose to return her home and not tell her why it is. And so for the longest time, she thinks that she's only there for a little while, that she's going to be saved, that Mama and Papa are coming back to get her. All the while, she is having to make peace with living and starting to do chores. She doesn't know how to peel potatoes. She doesn't know how to go grocery shopping, but her younger sister is sort of her saving grace in this book, because she has older brothers, and one is, there's a bit of tragedy, of course. The Italians love a good bit of tragedy, but that's such as life. I don't want to give too much away. I do recommend reading this book. I love reading about the thoughts of children, or, you know, like children growing and thinking and seeing their inner innocence on full display, their naivete, and how they're able to quickly adapt to new surroundings and yet hold on to these hopes that they are actually going to be saved. Like, it's incredible to think how our brains want to protect us. And so it's her essentially going back to her family. Does she make peace with that? She's an incredibly bright student, which is potentially her saving grace, a little bit similar to Lenuccia with Elena Ferrante, right? So there's that interest in finding out how one fits into this newness, while also expectations. The expectations of children are just, I mean, they're as strong as some of the greatest love stories, that children just expect that they will be returned, they will be saved, that they are wanted. But it's very interesting to see her try to make a new life with her actual mother and father, whilst trying to make sense of the fact that she was abandoned by this other family that she considers she's more closer to than her natural family. An interesting read, some visceral moments. Love it. I have another B.P. Antonio book that I cannot wait to get to. Finally, we take a little break. And we read Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby, which is a collection of essays by an essayist and an author, and I think she's worked on the TV show Shrill. She wrote the bikini poolside episode on Shrill, which was probably my favorite episode of that show, and she's also worked on And Just Like That, but she's essentially turning 40, and it's her essays of remembering, you know, like past music and playlists, and she's leaving Chicago to move in with her new wife and her new stepkids into a small white Republican town. And it's hilarious, it's honest, it's incredibly vulnerable, but not in this sort of like forceful way. But there is just something so freeing about reading a woman capturing it as it is, not trying to be funny, but knowing how to get that last laugh. It's great. I immediately put her other books on hold at the library, because reading this book right at the time after reading those books was a great, let's just say, balm on my soul to kind of recharge. And she has a new book out, and that's how I think I came across her interview that she gave to New York Times Magazine. And just reading that interview, I was like, oh, I want to read more by her. I want more of her thoughts in my head. But she did call me out. She said, in the book, she says, you know, she's grateful for those who check her books out at the library, but that does not going to pay for her dinner. So guilty. Next, we return to James Baldwin, because that's how I am. Once I read an author and I'm sort of shook, I return to them. So we read If Beale Street Could Talk published in 1973, about a woman a girlfriend of a man who's falsely incarcerated, trying to navigate that sphere of the legal processes as an African American man incarcerated. It's the only book I read of Baldwin this month that featured sort of a female protagonist, and from mostly that female point of view. So I was interested to see that take on life, although in this instance it's so important to note that this young woman whose, again, boyfriend is accused of rape is set up. They're essentially either paid off by a white cop who's been eyeing him for a while, and the accuser escapes to Puerto Rico, and they're in the legal process of hiring a lawyer who begins to learn how difficult it is and how racist the judicial system is. So if you want to read the injustices of Harlem, New York City in that time period where that racism had such an overt aspect on everyone's life, like you feel that tension that something is about to happen while people are innocently at a vegetable stand on a Saturday buying their groceries, and how no one is innocent, and what it's like to be a black woman, a black man in America. So if you want to read that in a novelized form, I would. It's a small book, but it's a necessary book, which leads me to conclude with the final book that I read, the 9th one, Another Country, also by James Baldwin, published in 1962. This book has 7 sort of main characters, and there's, various chapters and essays are dedicated to their lives, to how their lives intersect, but also the very unique and individual-driven barriers they come up against. And some of them are black, some of them are white, one is Vivaldo is Italian. Set in Greenwich Village, Harlem, and France, among other locales. Another Country is a novel of passion, sexual, racial, political, artistic. Stripped of their masks of gender and race by love, hatred at their most elemental and sublime. An almost unbearable, tumultuous, blood-pounding experience. Almost unbearable. This book, at some points, truly was. There's only so many times and instances I thought and think that you can call a woman a whore, a prostitute, a cunt, what have you. I think if this were the first book I read by Baldwin, my question in reading this, not having the background of Baldwin, nothing, but just reading this at point blank face value, why do you hate women so much? Huh? Like, women are just, they're painted truly as like either mothers, psychopaths, or psychotic, and whores. And if they're virgins, they're gonna be whores. And mothers were probably whores. it was really difficult for me at some points to just like, okay, we get it. Like, why is this, the repetitiveness and that kind of like, I felt like I was being forced to call women whores throughout this book. I found it interesting. It definitely captures these elemental, almost like boundaries and barriers of, for example, one of the characters, Vivaldo, he ends up dating his best friend's sister who is black, and yet, you know, he's never going to introduce her to the family. So it's almost that capturing that boundary of what it's like to be a racist living with a black person and attempting to love them. And can that save you from being a racist? Like, it asks those elemental questions of, deep down, why are you going above 9th Street and what are you doing there? And again, there's some moments, there's a lot of sex in this book, a lot. Quite a few erotic moments, but some of these moments are captured with this sort of ennui, maybe. Like, maybe I just need to think a little bit. But honestly, I remember just like when I was done reading this, I put this book down and I was like, okay, enough already. I'm so ready to move on from this concept that women can only exist within these like very patriarchal stereotypes. And that's something I do not buy into. But I definitely think it's something that people bought into at this time period, and there are still people. But would I say that this is something that I would read this book to explore the lives of women? Not so much. I think it's, some of these women have experienced trauma. Some of them are sort of going on, you know, sort of as secondary characters, like Cass is to her husband Richard, who becomes a novelist. And so it's interesting to see what roles women do behind the scenes, like not in the service of their men, but what it is that they truly want. I wanted to see more of that. But yeah, this was, whew. Whoa! Okay, so that was June. I also saw this play at the Arena Stage in DC called Exclusion, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's no longer showing, but essentially it is about a Asian American sells the right of her book about the American Chinese Exclusion Act to Hollywood, and well, Hollywood runs rampant with, you know, tearing it apart and making it into some sort of kung fu movie. And so the protagonist is supposed to, what is she supposed to do with that, right? Does she accept that? Does she join that world? Does she embrace the watered down history? Or how does she come to terms with that? And does she? So I really enjoyed seeing this play. Also, I love a good matinee. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you've made it thus far, we are well into July. I hope that you are reading something that you are enjoying. If you're not reading, then I hope you're relaxing, doing something that brings you joy. And I will see you next month.